Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's take a look at how we create a foundational democracy. Okay, I'll give you a little bit of recipe. We go bam, 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 like Emerald or hello, like Julia Childs. Let me cook you up a nice, tasty democratic style government. Remember, we are not talking about this kind of democracy where two wolves and a sheep discuss what's for dinner. Okay, that's majority rules is not a democracy. So let's talk about what actually makes a democracy because there really aren't any instances ever where there's a successful state level government, a country level government that is just run by a people in a direct format. It just doesn't work. Rousseau's ideas of a direct democracy, as we're going to look at, we've seen some of the results of that when we got into our primitive politics simulation. And remember that when you give power to the people, they don't always do things that are very, very, very bright or very safe. So you have like Brexit, where the United Kingdom left the European Union. That was power to the people. It really has not gone well for their economy. Remember that slavery came from power to the people. You know, it was a democratic society that decided to enslave another group of people simply because of the color of their skin. And so when we get into this idea of democracy, you know, if Athens votes to kill Socrates because of his teachings, or the uh, the the Reichstag gives Hitler the ability to have authoritarian powers, or if Hamas takes Gaza in 2006 and then eliminates elections and doesn't give women rights, I mean, those aren't democracies. Then that's not a democratic style of government. So remember that democratization is when you transition from an authoritarian regime to a more democratic regime. And that style of government, what does it actually take for a successful democracy to take hold? Well, let's remember that originally, when most philosophers thought about democracy, they started out with the concept of state of nature, meaning what are people like before they actually organize into some sort of society. And you have Thomas Hobbes here with the picture that comes out of the Leviathan, because ultimately, what a government's going to have to do, it's going to have to be able to contain the nature, the natural instincts of people, and manipulate them in a certain way to be able to successfully create governance to deal with scarcity. So we have the state of nature. How do people actually behave before there was organization? And there are a few philosophers that offered up something. Well, first of all, since we're talking about recipes, let's talk about the cook that actually wakes people up, and that is Niccolo Machiavelli, who comes out with a book called The Prince. And within it, he basically details what it takes for a person to become a dictator, a tyrant. And it's his advice to princes and how you should rule. And it kind of woke people up into, wow, politics is really terrible. Like, the leader is, for the most part, not really out there for the people. The leader, sure, it's great that you love them, but yeah, Machiavelli literally says it's better to be feared, that you have to sometimes crush your oppressors, destroy their cities, do that kind of thing. And so people woke up to Machiavelli and they're just kind of like, oh, this is not really how I would want things done. And it kind of shows that, how leaders perceive people and each other. So this brought about another set of philosophers that kind of brought out different ideas. Number one, Thomas Hobbes. He said, people are violent, they are chaotic, and they need to have a ruler. So this is where Thomas Hobbes' idea that, look, you need a ruler that's going to come with a social contract, that the people will allow that person to rule, and that the ruler is going to be trusted to do the right thing. Now, obviously, we don't have a king, and Hobbes advocated for a king, but we do have a leader. We do, even in the United States, we have a leader, a chief executive, a president. And Hobbes was that guy that said you can't just have people go free for all. You need to have a ruler there. And this is where our idea of a president, comes into play, as the ideas from Thomas Hobbes. Then you kick into Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose ideas of a direct democracy don't really work, but you do have his concept that people must be free to rule themselves. The act of voting comes from the idea that the people have to be the ultimate authority within government, that people give you the right to rule. So the concept of a democratic system where people rule themselves, that really comes from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Then you have John Locke, and John Locke really brings in two things. One, the people must have the right to life, liberty, and property. And this is kind of the backbone to the Bill of Rights, our first 10 amendments of the Constitution, things like free speech and the right to a trial and a jury and right against unreasonable searches and seizures and right against uh, cruel and unusual punishment. This really comes from the natural rights that John Locke said everybody should be born with. He also came up with the idea that a ruler can be removed if they abuse those rights. So he takes Thomas Hobbes' idea and he kicks in a hey, look, in our system of government, the people need to have the ability to actually remove the ruler who's being abusive. Now, the most common way to remove a ruler, of course, is through democratic elections. You don't like that ruler, give them an automatic ejection seat, get out of here. Um, but you have to give the people the ability to do that. And finally, you have Charles Montesquieu, who says that power should be separated into three independent branches, the legislative, executive, and judicial powers, to prevent a ruler from getting too powerful. Remember that every democratic government out there exists to stop the chief executive, the president or prime minister, whatever the chief executive is, stop them from getting too powerful. And his idea was create separate branches of government, make them independent of each other, and make none of them too powerful. And this eventually comes into the ideas of our three branches of government. Okay, so we have the four philosophers here. Of course, Niccolo Machiavelli kind of woke everybody up, and Hobbes, Rousseau, Locke, and Montesquieu become the backbone of the American democratic ideals going forward. To add to all they're doing, free and fair elections with universal suffrage. That's suffrage is the idea of the right to vote. You cannot, prevent most of your population from voting. Obviously, young people at a certain age, it's still debated. But for the most part, you have to have universal suffrage. You cannot discriminate based on gender or race or ideology or religion. Everybody in your society needs to be able to cast a vote. And they do that because it confirms something called the social contract, which is where people voluntarily give up some of their natural freedoms in exchange for good political order. And when you have the vote, what you're basically doing is I am voting people into power. And it is inconvenience a little bit. You don't have total freedom in society, but I will live under your rules if you provide me order and security and protection and a society where I can live my best life under a free, um, free government with property, or in the United States case, opportunity, the pursuit for happiness. So the social contract is when you voluntarily give up natural freedoms in exchange for political order and security. And when you vote people into power, this is how you get to avoid Thomas Hobbes, where you have to have a monarch. If you vote people into power, you can vote people out of power that are breaking that social contract, not providing that safety and security and organization and protection. So it's really important that you have that ability to vote people in universal suffrage because it maintains that social contract. Okay. Mix in some government transparency and political efficacy. New vocabulary word. Efficacy is the citizens' belief that their vote matters and they can actually influence the government. People need to be able to see what's going on in government. That's how you prevent corruption. They do this by a free media that's going to report on what government does and then lets the people decide how to remedy that problem or whether it's even worth addressing. And then when the government does things and people are happy with it, they'll increase their political efficacy. And the more citizens believe that their voice matters and actually can influence government policy, the better off your country and your democracy are actually going to be. You can't just vote and then nothing ever happened. That creates apathetic voters. But when you have efficacy, you actually believe, wow, I'm voting on something that matters. It's really enhancing my experience within the country, and our democracy is working. Add a heap of political rights and civil liberties. Political rights are government actions that create equal conditions, anti discrimination laws, voting laws where everybody can vote, equal access to public education, public services. These are things that are civil rights. And when people are obviously are more equal in terms of their political rights. We're not talking about, like economics where everybody has their differences. We're talking about political rights, then democracies work better. Add in civil liberties, protections of basic freedoms from abuse from a government, things like free speech, free assembly, free religion, freedom of the press, fair trial, protection of private property. Those are basic liberties that most people are born with that cannot be taken away by the government. Okay. So once we have civil rights and civil liberties, now we have people that are given equal access to politics and that have basic rights that the government cannot abuse. All right. Black Lives Matter movement, we had protests all around the United States. 99% of them were peaceful. Why were they able to do that? Free assembly. In China, when they had the zero COVID protests, they risked detention in jail time just for walking out there with blank signs. Okay. And so this is an example of a free society with civil liberties versus a non-free society with civil liberty without civil liberties. Finally, mix in rule of law, where everybody has to follow the rules, including the government, and you have a successful democracy. Where are all these things identified within the United States? Well, you have the Declaration of Independence, which creates the United States of America, brings in the ideas of John of Rousseau. All men are created equal. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. You mix in there John Locke. You have Why We Left a Tyrant, okay, also John Locke. And of course, you have the United States Constitution that creates the government of the United States, where you bring in Montesquieu's three branches of government. You have the US government that has a president, Thomas Hobbes, and shares power. And of course, protections of people from the government, John Locke. That's how you create a successful democratic government.